Hi, welcome back to The Basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today it's my distinct pleasure to present the first in a two-part conversation with David Leaf, author of the recently updated God Only Knows, the story of Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, and the California Myth. I imagine many viewers already have a copy of this. If you don't, there's a link in the description below where you can order a copy. And a friend of mine, Frank Allison, recently reminded me that way back in 1985, something I had totally forgotten about, I bought and mailed him a copy of the first update of David's book. I was apparently a lot more generous back in those days than I remember being, but he's cherished this book for, 37 years now. So remember, if you know somebody that is interested in Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, or somebody that is a potential convert, this also makes a great gift. And also in the description is a link to the God Only Knows VIP experience, which David will be talking more about next time. For those of you who are curious, you can follow that link and check it out now. So let's get started. Here is a conversation with David Leaf. I'm very delighted today to be talking to David Leaf, UCLA professor, filmmaker, and author of the landmark 1978 book, The Beach Boys and the California Myth, which has just received its second update, 2022 update, called God Only Knows, the story of Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, and the California Myth. Welcome, and I'm sure a lot of people have already seen the talk that Professor Leaf did with Giggins on his channel a while back. If you haven't seen that, you should check it out. It's really great. Welcome. Thanks so much for taking time to talk to me. And if I could just
Thank you.
I
didn't realize it was going to be this many steps down into the basement, but
oh yeah. Yeah, it's like the crypt down here.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah. So before we start, I just wanted to fanboy a little bit and thank you. The 1985, this is the first update of the California Myth.
Mm-hmm.
I moved to LA in 1985 and I lived there till 2001. And right after I arrived, shortly after I arrived, I found this at Rockaway Records. And I had no job. I had very little money. I had a futon, a bag of clothes, and a television. And I figured this would be my good entertainment value. I was already a Beach Boy fan, but this book meant a lot to me. It deepened my understanding and appreciation of the Beach Boys, one of my favorite Beach Boy books of all time. And I was so excited to get this 2022 update. And I have to say, one of the things I remember in 85, you sort of had the thesis in the 85 update, it seemed to me, that Brian Wilson should start a solo career. And I'd seen Brian at concerts in the early 80s, and it seemed far-fetched that would ever happen. And I've never been
Yes.
so glad to be wrong about anything as I am about that.
Well, thank you for everything, Stephen. And Rockaway Records is one of the greatest record stores in the history of mankind. So we'll give them a plug as well. I was just there a couple of weeks ago. Wayne and Gary, the Johnson brothers, are just terrific people, and we're all just fans of the music. I mean, that's where it all starts, and something happens where we go beyond that, where it's not just like we enjoy hearing the music, but we're getting something else from it. And obviously, those of us in the basement are feeling that. In terms of Brian's solo career, the idea for what I wrote in the 85 update came out of something David Anderle had said to me when I had interviewed him for the 1978 book, and I didn't understand it when he said it, because I had no experience inside the Beach Boys world or Brian's world at that point. But he said the next big Brian Wilson thing will not come with the Beach Boys. I had no idea what that meant.
Yeah.
I didn't know there could be a Brian Wilson thing without the Beach Boys.
Right.
In fact, if I understand correctly, their contract with CBS Records required that on every album thered be a certain number of new Brian Wilson songs. So it was very unlikely that he was going to be a solo artist, particularly a touring solo artist. And so, ironies abound in all aspects of this story. But one of the strangest ones is that if Brian hadn't been in what he called prison for 9 years, when he was under the complete control of the mad doctor,
Mm-hmm.
that was the man who took Brian solo. It
Yeah.
took somebody who had complete control and had an economic interest in Brian being solo.
Oh, right.
And so as sick as all of it was, that's how Brian Wilson ended up as a solo artist.
That is a really interesting perspective I had never realized before. I mean, I always felt that he saved Brian's life in a way, but
He
that
did.
he was really responsible for the solo career. I had never tumbled to that before. That's very interesting.
It came out of what we'll call Landy Part One in 75, 76, when he didn't have total control, and the Beach Boys fired him because he was poking his nose too much into Beach Boys business.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly it was like, next time I get in there, when he was approached in 82,
Yeah.
I'm going to have, you're not going to be able to fire me. I'm going to have total control. And one of the things that, one never knows what's going to happen. So Brian sings a verse and a chorus of On Broadway at a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony for Lieber and Stoller. And two men in the audience, Sire Records president Seymour Stein and Warner Brothers president Lenny Waronker, both have the same thought. What about a Brian Wilson album?
Yeah.
And suddenly there was money on the table. Up until then, Brian had been recording with Gary Usher.
Mm-hmm.
And if one goes really deep and reads Stephen McParland's landmark publications of those diaries, it's pretty grim.
It is
It's
very
tough,
grim.
tough.
In fact, I don't think I've ever finished it. It's so grim.
It's I lived through it. It was my first real insight into how horrible the circumstances were, because Gary was calling me from time to time. And it was only by accident that I ended up involved with the 88 solo album. People have said, well, why didn't you write more about that period? And it's like, that's for somebody else to do. Let somebody else write that book, because I don't want to write that book. I don't want to read that book.
Yeah.
My book is designed to be a celebration of what's happened because Landy saved his life.
I remember when the Brian Wilson Presents Smile CD came out, that some reviewer said it raises the unlikely specter of this coming to a happy conclusion. And that's really been true since 85, with the first solo album and then this career that Brian's had in finishing Smile. A lot of it has really read like fan fiction, and it's really tremendous. I mean,
Yeah.
Brian played a Smile show here in Ann Arbor, and I called up a friend of mine who'd gone with me to see the Beach Boys in 82 when Brian was at a low ebb, and said, Brian Wilson is alive. Brian Wilson is playing a concert. Brian Wilson is playing Smile, and he's playing at walking distance from my house. This has got to be some kind of a delusion. And I went, and it was phenomenal. Another thing about Smile is that with all the legend and all the hype, it didn't disappoint.
I think I wrote it, very few times in life does anything meet our expectations, let alone exceed our expectations. And Brian Wilson Presents Smile, at least for me and my cloistered friends who had been waiting for it for decades, it did not disappoint us. It was heroic that he even tried to do it, thanks to Darian Sahanajan, the Wondermints, and the whole band. It was more than we ever could have dreamed of. You mentioned Ann Arbor, Michigan, and kind of the fan fiction of it. I remember being in Ann Arbor in March of 99 for Brian's first solo concert. And Dario Wilson was just a baby then. And my dear friend Ray Lawler and I went out in the night to look for, like a 7-Eleven or a grocery store that might be open. It's a raging blizzard. and we
At
turn and
Ann
we turn
Arbor.
up yeah, and we turned up the wrong street, and there on a marquee is An Evening with Brian Wilson.
Yeah.
And it was like, how is this possible? So there's been an endless series of miracles. The fact that he made it to 80
Yeah.
is just amazing. Last year he put out My Piano, which when I first heard about it, my expectation was, oh, he's going to play and sing a bunch of his best songs. And the
Mhm.
first time I heard it, it goes, well, where's the vocal? And so at first I was disappointed. And then the second time I listened, it was like, oh, this is really perfect. This is just, it's like an album of hymns. And I realized in 1999, that same year, that the music had nothing to do with the lyrics. We were in Tokyo. We had gone to Kyoto on an off day, Brian Melinda and myself for a tour. And the guy who was driving us around hardly spoke any English. And at the very end of the day, Brian and Melinda went into the gift shop to get something for their kids. And I was standing with him. I said, do you know who that man is? And he said, no. And I explained, I said, do you know who the Beach Boys are? And he said, yes. I said, he's the man who wrote the music. And I said, would you like to come to the concert in Tokyo? And he was like, well, let me see if I can get the night off. And I gave him my cell number, and he called and said he could come. Ordinarily, getting concert tickets at the last minute, if you're with the artist, is not an issue. In Tokyo, Brian was sold out 3 nights in a row. And when I asked for a pair of tickets, they said, all we have left are the Royal Box.
Oh.
So this very lovely, humble couple arrives, and they're escorted to the Royal Box.
Oh.
If the emperor had come that night, they would have had to leave.
They had to share. Yeah.
But anyway, after the show, I brought them back, he and his wife backstage, and in the Japanese tradition, they brought us presents. And then he said to Brian, your music makes my heart soar. I've written a lot of words about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys and their music. I don't know that there's a better sentence. Your music makes my heart soar. After they left, Brian and I were walking back to his dressing room, and we had a conversation. He says, that's the reason to tour. For
Oh.
people like that who feel it so deeply. One of the things, and it's a terrible thing to say, but I've come to believe that all of the abuse Brian suffered in his life, starting with his father, that the music was created to heal himself, to make himself feel better. And we're the lucky beneficiaries of it. And if he had not gone through that emotional turmoil in his life, I don't think we would have gotten music that was as deep as what he created.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I mean, you hate to think that an artist has to suffer, but whether it's necessary or not, I think that's very true. Do you have any thoughts, getting back to Smile, on why he was ready to do it when he did it?
Well, there's a certain sequence of events that happen. One is the 1993 Good Vibrations box set, in which for the first time, Smile music is released to the world officially in a coherent way, as opposed to dribs and drabs on albums like Cabanescence on 2020. So there's a sequence of Smile music. Not only does the world not come to an end, but it's a giant success because the Smile music is on that box set. So that was kind of the first step. I talked to Brian about it. We discussed it. We picked the songs. You know, being his friend is one thing. Working with him on projects is another. He deserves to be treated with the respect of a great artist. And so if you treat him with that respect, he responds. So that's what happened with the Good Vibrations box set, as well as the Pet Sound Sessions. We had a whole series of releases that would follow that. We were going to do a 2 CD Good Vibrations Sessions, and then a Smile Sessions box for the year after the Pet Sound Sessions box. Not that one.
Oh.
This was 1997.
Oh.
But when the Pet Sounds box was delayed, I was, for lack of a better word, excommunicated from Beach Boys projects. So I was no longer doing them anymore. And so it took a long time for the Smile Sessions box to come to fruition. So he was ready. He liked the idea not of finishing Smile, but of putting the music out. Here's what I've done. Because he was a little tired of being asked, when are you going to finish Smile?
But he was okay with the sessions being released much earlier than they were then.
We had a 5-year plan,
Interesting.
and it was short circuited. The next big step was the Radio City tribute, because he performed Heroes and Villains at that show. The Boys Choir of Harlem performed Our Prayer. Vince Gill, Jimmy Webb, and David Crosby did an incredible Surf's Up. And again, people went crazy for the music. The world didn't come to an end. More than that, Brian started adding those songs to his live shows. So he was performing Heroes and Villains, and I think Wonderful and Surf's Up live. And in 2003, the conversation was, okay, you've toured Pet Sounds. What next? What? And I wasn't part of that conversation. I just remember hearing the result of it. It had been announced that he was going to do Brian Wilson Presents Smile in February of 2004 at Royal Festival Hall. And all we thought was, well, we'll be there to cheer him on. I had no idea what was going to happen. The fact that he did the Heroes and Villains at Radio City was just one of those, I don't know if it's a happy accident, but we were at a Christmas party at band member Scott Bennett's house, and Brian and my late wife were sitting on the piano bench next to each other with their back to the piano. And Brian said, what do you want for Christmas? And she said, for you to play Heroes and Villains. And he said, okay. And he just turned around and started playing it.
Wow.
As I think Darian or Probin describes it in Beautiful Dreamer, everybody came running from every part of the house because it was clearly Brian playing a song that you couldn't talk to him about up until that moment. So those were the steps. Then came the mountain. How do you sequence Smile so it's coherent? And that was a job that fell to Brian, Van Dyke, and Darian. Darian doing a big portion of the work. Another happy accident. Frank Holmes had given me the handwritten lyrics many years ago. I'd given the lyric sheets to Darian, and they couldn't read one of the words. So in Van Dyke's handwriting, they called Van Dyke up, and he came over. And there were all these things that happened. But I think as much as anything, and it's a phrase I'm not even sure I understand, there was a critical mass. That Brian had toured. Pet Sounds had been so well received on his tours in 2000 and 2001. I mean, they were visitations. People could not believe he was doing Pet Sounds.
Mhm.
I couldn't believe he was doing Pet Sounds. It was, I mean, I couldn't believe it so much that when we were planning the Radio City tribute, we were going to have a start to finish performance of Pet Sounds, because there's no way Brian's ever going to do it. And by the time we sold the tribute, he had already toured Pet Sounds. So we still did it at Radio City, and by then the band knew it, perfectly. So it was lucky from that point of view. But I think it was just all of these steps, all of the comfort he got starting in Ann Arbor in March of 1999, that there's an audience that wants to hear Brian Wilson sing and play music, as opposed to being told, you're a Beach Boy. For better or for worse, you're a Beach Boy. And so now he's on his own, and he's seeing it's working out. There are no backstage battles. There's no arguments. There's no fist fights.
Right.
It's a great vibe.
Yeah.
And the band is in a prayer circle before each show.
Yeah.
They're like a safety net for a trampoline artist. They're
Yeah.
there to catch him if he has a bad night.
We'll leave off here for this time. There is much more interesting stuff yet to come. I want to thank David Leaf for being so generous with his time and for all the great stories and insights. And also want to thank Martin Steele for doing the virtual introduction that made these conversations possible. Thank you very much, Martin. I look forward to your comments. Please hit like and subscribe if you don't mind, and we will see you next time for more with David Leaf. Bye.